and then we can make a start. So, Mike, hi, good evening. We meet again.
Again.
So, you're good to have Mike here as the first of two York Environment Week webinars. Actually, there's another one. Again, I'll put some more info in the chat about. I think this time next week, which is on the geothermal side. So you're obviously a man of many hats. Just bear in mind the two talks that you've got coming up this week and next week. So tell us a little bit more, Mike. What are your kind of main hats that you wear at the moment?
Oh, yeah, there's rather a lot, I'm afraid. That's the benefit of being retired and not being retired. I've been a counsellor for about 7 years, but that's fairly immaterial to this. I've been involved with slowing the flow for, well, since before it was ever called slowing the flows. It's about 18 years now. I'm part of the community interest company in Pickering. I'm a member of the internal drainage board. So anything to do with water flooding, and I'm a bit obsessive about it, I'm afraid.
Okay, good stuff. It sounds like you're the man for the job tonight. Anyway, so. What we will do, let me see if I can find your slides. They should be open here somewhere. And if I give you control, Mike, let me just find the right button for that bit.
Right, that looks like we're there. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, and off we
Right,
go.
I'll make a bulk apology because I've just started with a cold, so I won't keep saying every time I sneeze or cough. But everybody, look on the bright side. You could all be packed into a little village hall with me, and instead of that, you're safe and secure at the other end, away from the germs. All right. Oh, hang on a minute. Why has that moved on?
I think that's probably me, Mike.
Oh,
Apologies.
right.
Go.
No, that's
I'm
okay.
fiddling too much. Go back. Can you go
Right.
back? Yeah.
Okay, this is all about slowing the flow in Pickering. I always say I'm a non-expert because I haven't got any qualifications. I don't work for any of the statutory bodies like the Environment Agency and so on. So all I've got is 18 years worth of practical experience. So you got to work out for yourself whether that's actually worth anything. So off we go. This is where I live at High Mill in Pickering, and that's the view out of the French windows in my lounge, a couple of yards away from me. So that probably gives you an idea of why I got interested in flooding in the first place. Although it was mainly because I was member of the Civic Society in Pickering, and we had. I'll move on a slide. Oh yeah, what are the most important things in life to you? I like to ask this question. Just have a quick think about it. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, family," and I quite like going on holiday and stuff like that. But what about the things that keep you alive? And that's clean air, clean water, and good nutritious food. Because without those things, you're going to be dead within sort of 10 minutes, a couple of days, or a couple of months. So, who provides those things? Well, at the risk of sounding like some sort of swampy type, it's easier to say Mother Nature. So, with some help or unfortunately a lot of hindrance from us, and that nature has a very holistic balance. So, who better to work with? I mean, do we know better or does nature know better? It's been around for rather a long time. There are three key ways that we manage water, and they tend to conflict with each other. One of them is agriculture, for which we generally need to drain the land, get the water off it. Then there's flood risk management, as in we're trying not to flood houses and businesses. And then there's number three, the ecosystem. And I'll say that we in inverted commas, human race, we very much prioritize one and two, agriculture, because obviously we need to grow the food. And we tend to get rather concerned when we get flooded. But rarely do we look at the ecosystems with the sort of focus that we should do. Uh, you know, how do we cope with climate change with regard to all these three? Because, as I said, we're managing water in a slightly different way for all those three. One of them, you're trying to get water off the land, move it quickly away. Another, really, we've got to store the water, hold it upstream, keep it where nature means it to be, rather than having it in our houses. And ecosystems, we ignore at our peril. You know, I mean, I always think about the pollinators in particular, but you know, we are part of the ecosystem. We're not something separate from it. We are part of it. And unfortunately, we've got a nasty tendency to upset the balance of nature. And it's not going to do us any good. So, well, come on, move on. Oh, well, that's jumping around rather strangely here. I lost control of that. Sorry about this. It's gone backwards.
If you click the screen to take control again, Mike, you should be okay.
Yeah, I just have to. Ah, right. Ah, right. I've caught up at last. Right. Well, I try not to keep these talks too technical because I never know who's actually listening and with what level of knowledge. But this is sort of technical, but not that technical because I'm going to talk about the hydrograph. And in case you're thinking, oh, blimey, I don't know what you're talking about now. Hydro means water, and a graph is one of those things that you used to do at school. In my case, rather a long time ago. The key thing about this, if you look at that blue line, that is what the water does. And if you look at the x-axis along the bottom, that's the hours since the onset of rain. So basically that is time. And if you look at the y-axis that goes up the side, that's the amount of water. And it's either the flow discharge, as in how much water is running down the river, or it could be the volume of water, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But when it rains heavily, you start off at a low level and the water runs into the river and it builds up over time until it peaks, usually just after the rain has stopped, and then it drops off again. But the important thing about that is if you look at the, oh, that's moving again on its own. What's happening here? That's doing odd things, Paul. That suddenly moved on. Oh, right. I'm back again. Anyway, so if you think of that as the amount of water, look at the dotted line and consider that that is the amount of water that you need before you start flooding a town. It's easier for me to think of Pickering, but this is a talk for York Environment Week, so it could be York, it could be anywhere. So it's that little section at the top of the hydrograph. If I just give a wiggle with my cursor, that's the bit that floods the properties. So if we could get rid of that peak above the dotted line, hopefully you could stop flooding. Now, the key thing is, because I said along the bottom, it is time. So I hope you'd agree that if you can stretch out that time, then it would bring down, you've got the same volume underneath both graphs, whether the blue one or the red one. It's just that the red one, it's stretched out over a greater period of time. So when I say slowing the flow, as in you slow the water by holding it up in the catchment, the slowing means stretching out that time period, and that gradually pulls the hydrograph down. Now that can mean the difference between flooding or not flooding. And if you're in somewhere, a big conurbation that's got flood walls, that could be the difference between the water overtopping the flood walls or not overtopping them. So it's hopefully a bit simpler than it first sounds. So flooding, a definition a rising and overflowing of a body of water, especially onto normally dry land. So why would we only deal with flooding where it occurs? I suppose I should point out that the pictures, that's actually a picture of some of the, one of the, what we call mini bunds, right up in the top of the catchment here. And that's in very wet weather where it was, you can quite clearly see that it's filling up behind it and creating a nice pond, as in slowing the flow. So why only deal with flood water where where it's a problem? Surely it's better to look further up in the catchment and try and do something about that. And I tend to think about, you go to the doctors with a bad back or something like that, and he gives you painkillers or anti-inflammatories, and you're not actually dealing with the problem, you're dealing with the symptoms. So, really we need to deal with the proper problem rather than the symptoms. So a couple of basics, and that's a picture of a woody debris dam, just a small one, rather beautifully blending into the into its environment because it's been there for a while. And that's just a simple leaky dam that in higher flows will hold a bit of water behind it. You can clearly see that it's not a lot of water, but it'll hold some. So the first of the basics that I learned is water always runs downhill. So if we've got any non-Yorkshire people here, I could do a translation for you, but I don't really need to. It sounds simple, but it really is important. Now, the water will also take the path of least resistance. So if you've got a track or a road, it'll run down there. Gradient's also important, particularly from the point of view of there are a lot of rivers and watercourses that have been straightened over the years with a view to moving the water quickly away. So when you straighten a river, if you think about a wiggly river, nicely meandering, and you go from A to B, as in the top of it to the bottom of it, if it runs in a straight line, it's a much shorter distance than the distance going along the wiggles. But it's covered the same gradient, which means that when you straighten a river, you actually increase the gradient of it. It's a bit like trying to go up a hill on a bike. If you wiggle from side to side to make the gradient easier, rather than just going in a straight line, although we're talking about going downhill here. So if you increase the gradient, that means the water will move faster down as it's got more energy, it goes faster, it'll scour more, which means it'll sort of take away the bankings, carry more of the stones and so on in the river. It'll also take more sediment with it, which is the stuff that when you listen to the Dredge It All Brigade, they want to get rid of. So surely it's rather more important to address where that sediment comes from in the first place. Here's another complicated sounding terminology, hydraulic roughness. Not really. Hydraulics is just the study of water and what water does, or other fluids. And if you've got more hydraulic roughness, that is the resistance to water flowing. So if you think of anything that we tend to build that's either concrete, tarmac, solid roofing, whatever, water will flow off that very quickly because it's got virtually no hydraulic roughness. But then if you've got bare ground, so fields that are left bare in the winter, some of the water will soak in, but it's much easier for the water to run off, especially if there's a gradient on it. The more you have tussocky grass, trees, hedges, and all those sort of things in the way, the more it impedes the water, as in the more hydraulic roughness. And that's really important because that allows the water to infiltrate into the ground instead of running off. And hopefully it stops the sediment running off as well. I'm sort of making some of this sound very simple. Actually, the whole issue of flooding is more complicated the more you look into it. But don't be thrown, because I'm not trying to teach students in university, although we have got somebody from university on here. So it's surprising how complex the study can get when you look at it in depth. Now, one of the things that I got involved in very early on was it was following serious floods in Pickering in 1999, 2000, 2002, and then 2007. The Environment Agency had come in at the behest of government and said, oh, what you need is flood walls. And there were sort of problems because we're at the mouth of a steep gorge. We're not on a floodplain. And CBA doesn't mean can't be asked. It means cost-benefit analysis. The Environment Agency came in after an awful lot of time and energy, said, well, actually, you don't qualify on the basis of cost-benefit analysis. And this is a common problem for anybody in a rural area or even quite large towns when you're spending millions potentially on flood walls, hardened flood fences, and yet the number of properties that you're protecting don't sort of add up in terms of the overall cost. So eventually the Environment Agency went away and said, if anybody's got any good ideas, come and tell us, but in the meantime, you're on your own. And there was a bunch of academics who'd worked up a topic or a study all about how when communities lose faith in the government, in the authorities, in the agencies and so on, and they thought that this was all about the sort of social science side of things. But they thought that flooding was the ideal vehicle for this. And as Pickering had flooded several times, they came to the town and said, is anybody interested in working with us? And I got involved in that with Oxford, Durham and Newcastle universities. And because I'm a bit of a sado and I like to research things and understand what I'm talking about, I thought this is great because I can learn from all these academics. But in actual fact, they were learning as much from us because we had the on-the-ground knowledge of how it floods, where it floods in this area. And they were actually quite out of their comfort zone because they were coming to Pickering rather than sitting in the university and sort of telling everybody about the theory. This was all about the practical side. So at the end of this study, which lasted for a year, and as I said, we probably learned as much as they did, but we ended up getting them doing what was effectively a feasibility study because we said, well, couldn't we build a series of upstream bunds or small dams to hold the water so that instead of flooding the town, it would flood further upstream? And we ended up with a report, which we called Making Space for People. Everybody cleared off at the end of the sort of official study. And I was left with this report and thinking, well, we've got to do something with this. So I sent it to my MP. He took it to the Environment Agency and said, well, here's your idea. What are you going to do about it? And thus, we ended up with the Slowing the Flow project, which was when that terminology was first coined, which was a great title for it, Slowing the Flow, because that's exactly what it did. And I find it really satisfying all these years later when I was using this sort of terminology about slowing the flow, and we need to take a whole catchment approach, and we need to look at the upper catchments. And you were sort of looked at as if you were a bit of a, as I said before, tree-hugging, loony, lefty, swampy. And now, every time there's a flood, a really bad flood in this country, you tend to find people on the television like ministers and high-level agency chairs and so on saying, oh, yeah, what we need to do is slow the flow. And I always think, yep, thank you very much. Oh, we call ourselves the Rydale Flood Research Group. That was just the title. So really, the important thing is putting the right measures in the right places. And sometimes that might mean hard flood defences. But we need to be aware that if you build flood walls around a town, it only protects the immediate vicinity of that town. And it actually can speed the water on the flood risk above and below. Interference there.
Your nose is as long as the telephone wire.
Can you just put yourselves back on
I
mute,
have a
please.
problem. Did I not?
Just hang on a second, Mike. I'll deal with the
No.
mute and then we'll get it back. I think that should be it. Yeah, do keep yourselves on mute if you wouldn't mind. Just helps to keep the background noise down.
Okay, so right
You
measures
might
in the
need to
right
just
place.
click and get control of the screen again, Mike.
Right, yeah, great stuff. Yeah, so the right measures in the right places. So sometimes it is a good idea to have hard flood defences because you've got a big city and a lot of properties are vulnerable. But on the other hand, are you speeding or are you slowing the flow? And CABA, that's catchment-based approach. That's one of these terms that the Environment Agency like to use. A catchment-based approach, how about looking at the upper catchment where we should be trying to hold as much water back as we can and slowing the flow, and then getting down to urban areas, we want to get the water through there as effectively as possible, so keep it dredged and so on. And then below the towns, when you get onto the floodplain, we should be trying to get the water out into the floodplain, which often means reconnecting the river with its floodplain. And at this point, it's worth saying that the floodplain is actually part of the river. You might not think so, but it is. It's just the part of the river that the river uses when it's got a very high flow. So is it really a good idea to be building in a river, as in putting your businesses and your houses there, and taking away that area that the river previously used for storing the water? I would suggest that it's not. But then there's always this conflict between the agriculture, the housing, the industrial, the economy. So there's a balance to be had there. And unfortunately, I don't think we quite get the balance right. Things do seem to have been improving in recent years simply because so many places have been flooding. Flooding is getting more serious, it's getting more frequent. And if we're building, I'll say we, the royal we, if the big house builders are building in floodplains, and then suddenly what you thought previously was an area relatively safe from flooding, and it suddenly gets flooded, good old building company Bodgett and Scarpa have disappeared down the road with the profits, and it tends to be the public purse that has to pay for the flood defences. The picture there is our upstream bund at Pickering, which, when I say it's a bund, it's just a dam wall from one side of the valley to the other, with a simple culvert going through it. No sluice gates or anything like that. It just holds an awful lot of water, potentially. Speeding the flow, the bad side of thing. That's a lovely picture of a river. Well, it would be, but that's actually the road that I live on. So that was Pickering's basic flood defences from years ago, a raised pavement so you could keep your feet dry. That's in one of the fairly regular floods that we have, because it's very flashy. We're very close to the catchment, so the floods rise quickly and then fall again. So a lot of people will say, oh, well, all we've got to do to stop flooding is dredge all the rivers from source to sea. Great, move all that water very quickly. There's a big problem with that because we tend to have conurbations. We have villages, towns, cities on every river. And as soon as, if you speed the flow and get an awful lot of water moving quickly, speeding the flow, if you think back to the hydrograph, that squeezes up the time frame and makes that spike go up higher for a shorter period of time, but it's that bit at the top that does the flooding. So you're actually increasing flood risk as soon as it gets to those conurbations where there are constrictions in the river. There are culverts, sometimes there are invariably bridges, narrow sections of the river and so on. So unfortunately, the dredging thing doesn't work, albeit sometimes it's essential to get the water through the town itself, as long as you've slowed the water beforehand. Bare ground speeds the flow because there's reduced hydraulic roughness. I covered that earlier. So that's very much dependent on crop type. So it's not a good idea for farmers to leave bare ground in the winter. No-till agriculture you may have heard of. That is where instead of ploughing up the land, they drill it, as in they plant a crop, but going through the existing grass or whatever's growing on the field. And that has a lot of advantages. I'm not a farmer, so some farmers or some crops may not work well there. In terms of speeding the flow, deforestation and grubbing out hedges, again, you're removing or reducing the hydraulic roughness, so the water can move over the land much more quickly than if it's got trees and hedges on it. Soil compaction, that's quite a common problem nowadays with overgrazing, as in too many animals on a piece of land, so the hooves compact it, and ever heavier machinery, bigger and bigger tractors. So it's sort of squeezing the soil. And if you've not got that nutrition going back into the land, as in the sort of carbon of crops rotting down back into it, a soil with good organic matter can hold up to 80% more water and hold that water in there. So that's actually a benefit to the farmer, because that reduces the drought risk as well as reducing the flood risk. And those are the two sides of the climate change coin. And then we seem to have an ever increase in impermeable surfaces, and that's all the buildings, the roads and so on that we put on there. And those are the bits where the water really runs off very quickly. And every time I say runs off quickly and speeds the flow, just think back to that hydrograph and the effect of squeezing up that time frame, and you always make that flood peak higher. Well, slowing the flow, we can still have effective draining, but slow the flow using natural flood management. And all that it means is how nature would do it itself. Either let nature do it, or we can ape nature. And we can have leaky dams, which sort of create temporary ponds. When the rain falls heavily, the water will temporarily store between those behind the dams, but of course they leak, and so the water gradually flows out again over time, hopefully when the rain has stopped. Tree and hedge planting, moorland drain blocking. So instead of water running quickly off the moors, we try and block the drains, restore the peat, and particularly sphagnum, which holds a massive amount of water. And that means you've got a huge sponge up there instead of draining it quickly just for the sake of a few grouse and a few sheep. Attenuation ponds, that just means wherever you can create a pond, do so, but with a limited outflow. So the water fills up in heavy rain, but flows out gradually. And those can be even old mill ponds. You know, there are ponds everywhere. We should really be utilize them. Soil quality, soil organic matter. Oops, jumped on again. Yeah, soil organic matter, I've covered that one. That's really quite an important one. Buffer strips on agricultural land. Of course, that's taking away agricultural land, but it really is important. If you can get at least a couple of meters next to a river, increase that hydraulic roughness, stop the water running off quickly, so it's a benefit to the farmer keeping the water on there, as long as it's not staying on there for too long. But that also stops a lot of the sediment and his topsoil running off, and the various inputs that cost him a lot of money. It stops them running off into the river, where they create another problem by promoting weed growth. SUDS, that's sustainable drainage systems. That can be either rural or urban, and that's using the same sort of theory, especially in urban areas. You can have berms and ponds and so on, and swales, which just mean things that store the water and stop it running off quickly. instead of traditional drainage along pipes, which moves the water very quickly. Addressing the sediment supply, which I've already covered. We could stop cleaning rivers. We have a bit of an obsession with everything must look neat and tidy. But when trees fall into rivers and across rivers, as long as it's in the right place, preferably in the upper catchment or on a floodplain, the water actually gets trapped behind that. But we have a terrible tendency to say, oh, that looks untidy. We better clear all that away. But that's the way that nature slows the flow and stores the water. I've mentioned drought a couple of times because that is the other side of the climate change coin, and it is just as important and just as damaging, and it's likely to happen more and more frequently. Now, beavers will actually do what we, hang on, I lost it again, yeah. Yeah, I'll go on to beavers in a minute. Slowing the flow in Pickering, there's a couple of pictures here of contractors building woody debris dams, which are just leaky dams. And then there's a mini bund, which isn't exactly mini, because it's in the middle of the forestry. Most people didn't know it was there, and yet there were a few thousand cubic meters of storage for when the river was very high. But then there's a nice picture of some of the debris dams when it's actually in high flow conditions, and you can see the amount of water ponding behind it. So natural flood management is about working with nature and not fighting against it or thinking that we know better. And a lot of people will say, well, it's all minor stuff. They're only tiny, you know, there's only a little bit of water stored behind these various dams, but it's all about being cumulative. And when I said flood walls only protect the immediate vicinity around a town at a cost of millions, whenever you put these sort of measures into the upper catchment, that slowing the flow effect is cumulative. So every pond, every dam, and so on that you put, you add together the effect of potential water storage, and that slows the flow for the whole length of the river downstream. So I'm also a cyclist, and aggregation of marginal gains is an expression that was coined for cycling. There are also really huge benefits to biodiversity of all this sort of thing, because you've got a good aquatic environment. Resilience, yeah, that's quite an important one on top of the slowing the flow. That is trying to build properties so that they are resilient to flooding, which means when they get flooded, excuse me, you can restore them more quickly. So build them with sort of stone floors or flagged floors, so that the effect isn't as bad, and you one-way valves on toilets and those sort of things. Now, there are two big problems with natural flood management, and that's getting the landowner permissions and finding the money, which is something that we had a bit of a problem with when we initially got the slowing the flow scheme up and running, because the Environment Agency said, well, you can't have any money to do that because there's no evidence that it works. Well, how do you get the evidence? Well, you've got to get the money to build it and provide the evidence. So you've got this circular argument. Anyway, build it we did. But just as a side point, after some major floods in 2015, I happened to be on holiday in Lanzarote for a week, and I caught sight of this right at the top of the island, a place called Tagiz. And they'd put these leaky dams there just using the volcanic rock and a series of them. So going from the citadel at the top with water obviously would have been running fast down towards the village below. And it was exactly the same. So there's nothing new about all this stuff. It's more or less reinventing the wheel. And if you want to build these measures, you just use what's there, whether it's timber, stone, or earth bunds or whatever. So one of the key components of the Slowing the Flow scheme was an engineered bund, and that's up about a mile and a half upstream of Pickering, in one of the few areas upstream, because it's a very narrow, steep-sided valley, and there's one area where it widens out, so a lovely bit of floodplain, but you can probably see that the river was very deeply incised, and a lot of that was through the river being straightened in various points, so it moves more quickly, albeit you can see that meanders quite nicely. But we built this bund, I say we, the Environment Agency and the contractors built it, and as I said, it was literally built out of clay because it had to comply with the Reservoirs Act, from one side of the valley to the other, and you can sort of see the control structure, which a concrete face at either end with a culvert going through it. So it was just a simple culvert, no sluice gates or anything. And potentially that holds 120,000 cubic meters of water. It's also known as a flood storage area in technical jargon. So when that culvert was covered up by the clay bund, and the grass was seeded and the surface was sort of armoured to protect it from high flows, and you can barely see it in the landscape. The black pillars are actually a trash screen, although a mega trash screen, so that's designed to hold back full trees and big branches away from the mouth of the culvert. So the theory is it's just another leaky dam. So when you get heavy rain, under normal conditions, all the water flows through that culvert and restricts the flow through Pickering to around 14.5 cumex. That means cubic meters per second. And that just allows a bit of flooding in Pickering without getting into the buildings. But anything above that level, and the water can't all get through the culvert, so it starts to build up behind the dam, and the dam fills up. And the theory is, well, it's a practice actually, instead of flooding the middle of Pickering, it floods a field about a mile and a half upstream. One of these days, it'll get overtopped. We'll have an event that's big enough to fill the dam and overtop it, and the town will flood anyway. But I can say now that it's actually been in operation on 66 occasions since it was built in or completed in 2015. So that's 66 minor floods it's avoided, and we still haven't had a major one. But it's not a if, it's a when. It'll happen. So that was the Boxing Day flood. And even then, there was only about 6,000 cubic meters of water behind the bund. But it was rather better than it being down in Pickering town centre. But as you can see, this wasn't quite at the peak. But although there was some flooding, it wasn't actually flooding the buildings, and that's the important part. And on that Boxing Day floods 2015, there was absolute devastation across most of the north of England. And Pickering, because it had just got this new scheme, was protected. Admittedly, we were on the edge of the worst of the rain, but it was still rather good. Now, beavers. Oh, I'm running over time a bit, so I'll have to whiz through. Beavers actually do an awful lot of that natural flood management, because it just so happens that they build dams, leaky dams, and that is because that's their natural environment. The massive benefit from beavers is that they reduce flood peaks, they slow the flow, they open up the canopy, which increases the biodiversity massively. They improve the water quality because it's sort of filtered through, and they do all this at relatively little cost. Now, the only, as far as I'm concerned, having sort of looked into what they do, the only real drawback is when beavers come into conflict with, because they'll manage an area, and they using a family group, and as the family builds and gets too big for the area, they'll pair up and disappear off and find a new area. So if they start flooding a piece of land and flood agricultural land or flood buildings, then they need to be dealt with. So as far as I'm concerned, it needs a proper policy on how to safely deal with them because they are actually a protected species now since 2022. DEFRA did have, they did draw up a policy after lengthy consultation, but the Secretary of State for the Environment decided not to release that policy at the last minute, and it's not been released since, and that's 2 years ago. But it's certainly something that's needed. And they don't fell all the trees, because if you've ever felled a tree and you know how heavy they are, they're not easy to move. So they only fell trees that near the water, and they create their own perfect environment and store their own food, create their own food. The pictures there, there's a control structure when they fence, because the beavers in Cropton Forest are in a fenced enclosure, which is a legal requirement until somebody releases a policy and they can be released into the wild. And that sort of structure on the left is the big cage to stop them getting out of the fence, which hadn't at that point been put up, and moving downstream. But in the right-hand lower picture, you can just see the fence in the top left corner, but they've used those poles that were put into the beck to create a dam, which is a fantastic dam. Let's move on to the next one. That is the side, that's Kath Bashforth, who's the ecologist for the Forestry Commission, who looks after the beavers. They're left largely to their own devices. They try not to interfere with them. But that massive dam, which is just over 2 meters high, and last winter we had about 5 or 6, I think, named storms. So there was a serious amount of water, and that resisted every storm until the last one, where one of the dams partially gave way, but it's well up in the catchment, so it wasn't a real danger. And I'm quite sure they'll have fixed it by now. But you can see in the bottom right-hand picture the sort of environment that they create for high water, lots of pools and dams. So that's the end of that. My final point, and I'm sure we've got people who are genuinely interested in this sort of thing here, but these are a couple of points I say to people generally. You've got a remarkable brain, so use it and think about everything. There are limited resources on Earth, so don't waste them. Might be wasting my breath a bit with an awful lot of people. So think, question, listen, learn, but preferably from sources that you can trust. And that is called critical analysis. So on that point, I shall shut up and let people ask any questions. So if you want to raise your hand or whatever.